Imagine coming home early, expecting a quiet evening with the person you love. But instead, you hear a conversation that shatters everything. Laughter, casual words, and then a confession that makes your blood run cold. They think you'll never find out. They believe they've won. But now you have a choice. Be the victim or turn the game around. I chose the latter. The elevator ascended smoothly toward the penthouse, its quiet hum the only sound filling the space. Loosening my tie, I leaned back against the wall, letting out a slow breath. The tech conference had ended earlier than expected, giving me a rare opportunity to surprise Amelia. Lately, work had consumed most of my time, and I barely remembered the last time we sat down for dinner without distractions. Tonight, I intended to change that. As the doors slid open, I stepped into the silent hallway. The plush carpet absorbed my footsteps, and for the first time in weeks, I felt anticipation rather than exhaustion. Then, just as I reached the bedroom, I heard her voice, light, amused, effortlessly carefree. My hand hovered over the door handle, instinct telling me to wait. She was on the phone. At first, the conversation seemed harmless. A casual mention of me working late again. A sigh about how my job always came first. But then, a second voice responded, older, knowing. A comment about secrets not being as well hidden as she believed. The words landed like a blow. Laughter followed. A soft, familiar sound that had once been comforting. Now it felt like ice water down my spine. The name Adrian came up next. A new rooftop bar. Plans that had nothing to do with me. I stepped back from the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. The pieces fell into place faster than I could stop them. The long nights apart. The sudden interest in late-night outings. The effortless lies disguised as casual explanations. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage collapsed in an instant. Without making a sound, I turned and walked away. Inside my office, I poured a drink with hands that barely steadied against the weight of realization. The whiskey burned on the way down, but it did nothing to dull the sharp edges cutting through my mind. My gaze landed on my phone. There was only one person I could call. Within minutes, Alexander Hayes had agreed to meet. I left the penthouse without a second glance. Amelia would never know I had been there. Alexander's office was a sharp contrast to the storm in my mind. Sleek, modern, and perfectly controlled. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, a view that had once felt like an achievement. Now, it was nothing more than a backdrop to the chaos unfolding in my life. I sat across from him, recounting everything I had heard. Each word felt heavier than the last. He listened without interruption, expression darkening with every detail. By the time I finished, his posture had shifted, shoulders squared with quiet determination. There was no hesitation in his response. The next steps had to be taken immediately. Assets needed protection. Evidence had to be gathered. His network was vast, and he wasted no time putting it to use. A private investigator, his brother Derek, would handle surveillance. A cyber expert, Ethan Wolfe, would track digital activity. If there were messages, emails, or transactions that confirmed the affair, they would find them. The plan formed quickly, each piece falling into place with calculated precision. I agreed without question. The moment Amelia realized she had been caught, there would be no room for doubt, no space for denial. And when that moment came, I would be ready. The city lights flickered through the tinted windows of Alexander's office, casting long shadows across the glass desk. The weight of what I had overheard still pressed against my chest. But the initial shock had given way to something steadier, cold resolve. Alexander worked quickly, making calls, setting things in motion. Within an hour, two men walked into his office. Derek, a former detective turned private investigator, and Ethan, a cyber expert with a reputation for leaving no digital trace unchecked. Derek moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst of people and learned to expect nothing less. His sharp eyes missed nothing as he reviewed the details of what had happened. Methodical, efficient, he wasted no time outlining a plan. Amelia's movements would be tracked. Surveillance would be discreet but thorough. Every meeting, every interaction documented. On the other side of the room, Ethan had already pulled out his laptop, fingers moving at a speed that suggested he had done this countless times before. A few keystrokes, and he was inside the system, his expression unreadable as he scanned for patterns. Messages, location data, financial transactions. If Amelia and Adrian had left a digital footprint, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The information started coming in almost immediately. Bank statements revealed transfers Amelia had made over the past year. Small amounts, strategically spaced, sent to an account I had never seen before. Conversations, archived in encrypted backups, hinted at more than just a passing affair. They spoke of future plans, whispered promises, a life being built in the shadows of my own. Everything about it was calculated, and I had never seen it coming. Derek, still studying the files in front of him, finally looked up. His expression remained neutral, but there was a weight behind his words. The affair wasn't just a reckless indulgence. It was part of something bigger. Patterns suggested that Adrian wasn't just another man. He was someone with experience, someone who had done this before. Wealthy partners, carefully chosen, led down a path that ended in financial loss and personal ruin. Amelia had been a willing participant. The realization settled over me like a slow, suffocating pressure. I had spent years building my company, securing a future I thought belonged to both of us. Meanwhile, she had been quietly siphoning money away, weaving a second life out of the resources I had worked for. A cold certainty formed in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about control. I wouldn't let them take another step forward. Ethan continued working late into the night, unraveling more of the story with every passing hour. By the time the first traces of dawn bled into the sky, the picture was almost complete. Locations, conversations, transactions, a timeline of deception, meticulously laid out before me. Alexander leaned back in his chair, watching as I absorbed it all. There was no question about what had to happen next. Everything needed to be airtight. When the time came for confrontation, I wouldn't just be holding accusations. I would have undeniable proof, and Amelia would have nowhere left to run. The penthouse was quiet when I walked in, but the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of deception. She was in the living room, lounging with a glass of wine, looking as though she had no worries in the world. The sight of her, so at ease, made something tighten in my chest. For days, I had been collecting proof, peeling back the layers of lies, watching as the life I thought I had unraveled in front of me. Now I was done watching. She noticed me only when I stood motionless, letting the silence stretch between us. A shift in her expression, mild surprise, then quick calculation. Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass before she set it down. There was no real concern in her eyes, only the flicker of irritation, the kind that appeared when something didn't go according to plan. She made an attempt at normalcy, but the words she spoke felt empty, rehearsed. The same kind of casual ease she had probably used 100 times before. She was waiting for my usual response. A distracted nod, an excuse about work, anything that would let her slip back into the routine she had crafted so carefully. Instead, I remained still, studying her. A pause just long enough for discomfort to creep in. Then, the moment her mask cracked, I let it happen. The first name I spoke shattered the illusion. The shift was immediate. A flicker of confusion, then something colder, a quick assessment of the situation. A denial, smooth and practiced, laced with just enough disbelief to sound convincing. The reaction told me everything. There was no shock, no frantic attempt to cover up a misunderstanding. Just an immediate pivot, a rehearsed performance meant to put me on the defensive. She had expected this moment to come eventually. I moved past her, ignoring the attempt at control, placing an envelope on the counter. The weight of it was nothing compared to what was inside. Documents, screenshots, accounts of every moment she had tried to keep hidden. She hesitated before reaching for it, already knowing what she would find. When she did, there was no denial left. The shift in her posture, the tightening of her jaw, it was no longer about hiding, but about finding a way to regain control. The question I asked next was met with silence. For a brief moment, I thought she might attempt an excuse, a carefully woven narrative designed to manipulate the outcome in her favor. But then, something sharper surfaced. The pretense dropped completely. She had never intended to be caught, never expected the carefully built structure to collapse around her. The admission was unspoken but clear. There was no regret in her eyes, only the frustration of being exposed. The plan had never included an endgame where she lost. I didn't give her room to maneuver. The evidence was there, undeniable, impossible to twist into something else. I had spent years believing in something that had never existed, trusting a person who had used that trust as leverage. The realization settled in cold and final. She glanced at the phone on the table, but I had already anticipated the move, cutting off the chance before it could happen. The control she had carefully maintained over the situation slipped further, her carefully composed exterior starting to crack. The shift came quickly. When persuasion failed, anger took its place. Accusations meant to wound, threats laced with desperation. But none of it mattered. The foundation she had built this life on had already crumbled. The decision was already made. She wasn't staying. When I activated the security system, sealing the exits, frustration flared in her eyes. For the first time, she understood that the situation had truly slipped from her grasp. The walls that had once given her freedom now confined her. As I stepped out, her voice followed, sharp and filled with fury, but it faded into silence the moment the door shut behind me. The soundproofing ensured that whatever she had to say next would never reach me. For the first time in a long time, the quiet felt like something else. Relief. The night air was crisp as I left the penthouse behind, the city sprawling beneath me like a machine that never stopped moving. But my world had come to a halt days ago, the moment I had discovered the truth. Everything after that had been strategy, every decision leading to this moment. There was no room for second-guessing. Alexander had moved quickly, putting every necessary piece into place. The network we had built was working flawlessly. Derek had been tracking movements, Ethan had been collecting digital evidence, and together they had created an airtight case. Now it was time to take the next step. The evidence confirmed what I had already suspected. Adrian wasn't just a man having an affair, he was a professional. His history, once buried under carefully crafted identities, was now exposed. He had done this before more than once. Wealthy partners, strategic manipulation, financial ruin. A cycle repeated over years, leaving behind nothing but empty accounts and discarded victims. This time it wouldn't end in his favor. The plan was simple, precise. A business deal, an opportunity too good to resist. Green Haven was the perfect bait. A high-stakes project promising massive returns, dressed up just enough to seem legitimate. The kind of deal someone like Adrian wouldn't be able to ignore. His greed would do the rest. The meeting was set in one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place designed to make people feel important. He arrived exactly on time, every detail of his appearance curated for the role he played. Expensive suit, practiced charm, the ease of a man who had convinced himself he was untouchable. I had watched men like him before, studied the way they operated. Confidence masking deception. The belief that they were always one step ahead. He didn't know he was already losing. The conversation was smooth, effortless. He played his part well, nodding in all the right places, asking the right questions. I outlined the investment, the projected returns, feeding him just enough to keep his interest locked in place. He saw what he wanted to see, an ambitious project with a high reward, backed by someone too blinded by ambition to question his motives. He believed the version of me he had likely imagined, successful, distracted, vulnerable in all the ways that mattered. By the end of the evening, the deal was in motion. He left the restaurant confident, already picturing the outcome in his favor. But he had just signed his own downfall. While he celebrated the opportunity he thought he had secured, Alexander and Derek worked behind the scenes, finalizing every legal detail necessary to ensure the next step played out exactly as planned. Adrian's financial movements were monitored, his involvement in fraudulent activities meticulously documented. Everything was lining up for the final blow. Meanwhile, Amelia was unraveling. Surveillance confirmed her increasing frustration. Calls unanswered. Meetings cut short. The carefully built foundation she had relied on was starting to shake, and she could feel it. She had chosen the wrong side. When the final confirmation came in, the last signature needed to seal Adrian's fate. Everything was set. The evidence was undeniable. The trap had been triggered. By the time the authorities moved in, he barely had time to react. His world collapsed in a single moment, his confidence vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The mask fell away, revealing what had been there all along. Nothing more than a man who had finally run out of places to hide. The arrest was swift, decisive. The case against him was built on solid ground, every detail accounted for. There would be no escaping it this time. As the news spread, Amelia's silence said more than any words could. She had spent years believing she was in control, only to realize too late that she had been nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. Everything she had counted on was gone, and I had no intention of looking back. The aftermath played out exactly as expected. Adrian's arrest had been swift, the charges airtight. The authorities had more than enough evidence to ensure a conviction, and his past victims were beginning to surface, eager to see him pay for what he had done. His career as a con artist was over. Amelia had vanished from the public eye. With her reputation in ruins and her access to my wealth completely severed, she had no moves left to play. She had tried to reach out, calls that went unanswered, messages that remained unread. There was nothing left for us to say. I had already moved on. Green Haven, now fully under my control, was progressing at full speed. The scandal surrounding Adrian had, ironically, only strengthened my position. Investors saw me as the one who had outmaneuvered a fraud, the man who had exposed a con before it could do any real damage. My reputation, far from being tarnished, had only grown. The launch event for the project was set in one of the city's largest venues, the anticipation surrounding it palpable. The room buzzed with energy. Investors, media, industry leaders, all waiting for the unveiling of what was being called the future of sustainable living. I stood at the center of it all, calm, focused. Months ago, my world had been crumbling. Now, I was standing on the foundation of something stronger. As the presentation began, I introduced what would be the next evolution of my work, an innovation that would redefine the way people interacted with technology. Neuralink, a system designed to bridge the gap between human thought and digital function. The reaction was immediate. The audience was captivated, drawn in by the potential of what was unfolding before them. I had spent years building toward this, but now, for the first time, I felt like I was truly in control of my future. Among the crowd, one person stood out, Zara Corbin, a neuroscientist whose work had been instrumental in the development of Neuralink. She watched with the keen interest of someone who understood the significance of what was happening. After the presentation, she approached, her expression unreadable at first. Then, a nod of approval. A conversation that quickly shifted from professional to something more. Mutual respect, shared ambition. Something new, something real. Later that night, as I stood overlooking the city, a message from Olivia Chun lit up my phone. The investigative piece on Adrian and Amelia was set to be published. The final chapter in their story, sealed in public record. I read the last line of her message twice. Justice served. And a man who refused to be a victim. I set the phone down, exhaling slowly. For the first time in a long time, the past no longer held any weight. The future was mine.